Hey folks, Andrew J. Polk here. This is going to be our only segments online here today because, as you've been hearing on air, we are out of the studio for the rest of this week on some various business trips and things related to our broadcast. So don't worry, we'll be back in the studio here next week. But in the meantime, we still wanted to be bringing you some new content as well as reviewing some of the races that are going to runoffs, some of the victorious races, and the candidates and nominees we were able to speak with. That will still be going on the rest of this week. But ahead of all of that, we are taking the time to speak with Estefania Seyffert with our news partners there at KFOX 14. So want to bring you at least this new segment online for our social media audiences with a little bit of bonus extra, I guess, kind of thing that you'll be getting here. So otherwise, you'll still be getting the bulk of this interview and all the major things, but a little bit of extras here for you online. So hope you enjoy this extra segment. Welcome back here to Talk El Paso, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thank you for tuning in, however you may be doing so, being on air, online, live streaming through the free and reliable iHeartRadio app, and in limited ways over on our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, because we are, of course, out of the office for the remainder of this week, out doing some remote work, shall we say, here, but don't worry, we'll be back in live in the studio as of next week. But in the meantime, still have some new things that we wanted to take the time to talk to you about. So here joining us in studio, as we have for most Wednesdays, even if we're not here, we are joined in the studio right now by Estefania Seyffert, investigative reporter with our news partners there at KFOX 14. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Happy to have you on to talk about some of the other big stories because, yes, elections are very dominating, and we'll talk about what you'll be doing with that here in a second. But other investigative and special reports are definitely still going on, including that one that we've been teasing for you for a while now, and that is, well, simply titled, Where Do Drugs Seized in El Paso Go? It's an interesting question because as much as we've been talking about situations at the border, the smuggling attempts, the interdictions that happen, and the at least weekly news releases that we see coming out from ICE, CBP, Border Patrol, those kind of things with the varying levels of interesting stacks of illicit bundles, those kind of things. I guess I never really thought about what happens after. I mean, I guess I had vague assumptions of disposal somehow, but had no idea how that would then be actually dealt with.
Right. So, yeah, you're right. We had teased this story, and a lot of people were asking why I went to Dallas for a story that had to do with El Paso. And so what it is that the drugs that are seized in El Paso, they are sent to a lab, a DEA lab in Dallas, because they need to be analyzed. They need to see what type of drug trends they're seeing. And that's how they've noticed that there's been an increase in fentanyl, not just nationwide, but in El Paso, they've definitely seen that increase in fentanyl. And also the chemists who look into what is in these drugs that are seized can also serve as they can also testify during trials.
Of course.
So that's kind of how that ties in. But it's not just the DEA who sends drugs to this lab. It's also the FBI, ICE, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So there's other federal agencies that send drugs that have been seized all over Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma to this specific lab in Dallas. Of course, there are several DEA labs across the country.
Oh, of course.
The one that corresponds to El Paso is in Dallas. And so we got the chance to go see it.
So you went out again on location on your site there in order to actually see where the testing and storage, because, I mean, sure, disposal is eventually the question, kind of what I was talking about. But in the meantime, yeah, we got legal questions at hand. So up until those points, those are resolved. These are then more accurately called evidence.
Yes. So this is not only analyzed here, it's also stored in this facility. We got to see the vault where they store these drugs until they're given clearance by the federal agencies to dispose of it. And it was great images to see that, because, this is the first time the DEA has really ever given us access into their facilities, much less their lab and their vault where evidence is kept. And there were just boxes piled to the ceiling of this evidence. And we also got to see the process of how it's analyzed and how they're able to determine exactly what's in these drugs that are seized. They're seeing a lot of drugs in pill form.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why they have the One Pill Can Kill initiative, which is a campaign to let people know that really you can't trust any pill unless it's a prescribed pill coming from your doctor. And specifically for you, and right now they're seeing a lot of pills that have the M and 30, like oxycodone looking pills, but they actually have fentanyl, and it's a very
Yep.
small amount of fentanyl that could be deadly. And they're seeing, for instance, it's 2 milligrams of fentanyl that could kill you, and they're seeing some samples that have 7 milligrams. So it was very interesting to see the whole process and to see where all of this is kept, and the trends that they're seeing in El Paso.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember a demonstration essentially of that. I mean, people may think like, okay, why does fentanyl exist? Why is this? I mean, if it's so deadly, I mean, it does have medical purposes when applied very specifically, but when we're talking about these illicit uses, these counterfeiting in some cases of prescription, because they're essentially substituting what would be the actual medication you're expecting to get, even for those who aren't having illicit purposes on their own when they're taking it, thinking they're getting hey, I found someone who offers cheap fulfillment of my prescription. Great kind of thing. They probably aren't as stringent about asking you for a prescription. That should be red flag number one. But also I've seen previous demonstrations from law enforcement agencies across the country of that, sure, they have the fentanyl and it's a cheap replacement. It's kind of a way to dope up something without making it any more expensive, so they still see their profit margins, but that they are not anywhere near as stringent with the mixing of it. So it was essentially like an example of, say, an entire bag of sugar, and there was a few little grains of colored sugar to demonstrate the fentanyl, and mixing it up into these batches here, and how they're not doing it any kind of really scientific way with it or method. So you could end up with, sure, that amount of fentanyl throughout that whole sample size would maybe not reach the lethal level, but since they don't really care about you, that they may have, well, okay, there's a concentration of that one part of the sample, that one batch that we made that is 15 times what is allowable for the human body to not be injured or even survive. And so that's where the problems start coming in, and why these testings are important, and also those trends are important, particularly since one of the really kind of shocking bits of data that you have in the story there is on the amount of seizures coming into this area in just straight up kilogram amounts here, showing a beyond exponential rise.
Yes. So, and they put it in kilograms, and I converted it to pounds because I think that's probably easier for some people to understand.
Oh, sure.
So the seizures dipped to 41 kilograms, which is 90 pounds in 2020. Then they increased to 292 kilograms, which is 643 pounds in 2021. And 390 kilograms, which is 861 pounds in fiscal year 2022. These are all fiscal years. And the data that we got started from 2019, where they were only seeing 54 kilograms, which is 119 pounds. The number one drug that they continue to see at the lab and in El Paso is methamphetamine. They're also seeing cocaine and heroin. But what's alarming, if you will, is the potency of fentanyl and how quickly it's like the increase of it is being seen. And they're also seeing fentanyl in the meth that they're analyzing, in the cocaine they're analyzing, and in the heroin. So they're not only just seeing, fentanyl as in, this drug is fentanyl, they're also seeing it in other illicit drugs as well.
Again, if you're just joining us, guest right now is Estefania Seyffert, investigative reporter with our news partners there at KFOX 14. You want to find out anything more about this story, her other investigative work, or their work and stories in general, kfoxtv.com. And again, specifically for Estefania's stories, click under the KFOX 14 Investigates tab. So again, a lot of interesting details there. Definitely encourage people to take a look at the web story and go through. Again, you also got the video there because it's very impactful, but this is not even only the bit of investigative work that's going on in and around the region right now with you all. Another interesting one out as of early this week about, we've talked about it in kind of minor parts from time to time about the response needing to be seen in Sunland Park and Santa Teresa, and how that is essentially due to some physical barrier restrictions and things like that, one of the major hotspots for people trying to sneak through the border as opposed to other ways of presenting themselves to authorities, those kind of things. And so there is some border wall there. Of course, Mount Cristo Rey kind of complicates the whole situation and the base of it and the very rugged terrain there. But the actual impact on local first responders in that area specifically has been significant as well.
Right. So the Sunland Park Fire Department is the one that has been responding to whenever, there's a migrant that maybe fell off of the wall, or there, people trying to jump the wall. And Fidel Moreno Mesa had this special report, which basically looks at the calls that were made to the border wall for the department from fiscal year 2019 to this fiscal year 2022. And it looks like they're averaging about 25 to 30 calls a month. And so as of November 2022, the department was called out 234 times. In fiscal year 2021, there were 224 calls. And compared to 2019, there were 54 trips that were made to, the border wall, 70 in 2020. So it has gone up significantly. And that's something that the department says obviously impacts any other, jobs that they have as a fire department.
So again, it may not sound like it's overwhelming in this one specific aspect of it, but it might be tempting to think of this in terms for, again, the city of El Paso with its, dozens of different fire trucks, fire stations, those kind of things. We're talking about specifically the city of Sunland Park here, which has two, am I correct about that? I think it's one or two.
It is a much smaller department
smaller
for
overall.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not exactly sure in terms of, how many firefighters or even how many units they have or fire stations, but it is significantly smaller. And they are just seeing an increase in calls that they're having to respond to.
Two other fire stations I could think of offhand. Anyone from the city of Sunland Park, let me know, and please don't scream at me through the phone if I got that number wrong here. Those are the ones I can think of offhand, particularly along McNutt Road. But point is that, again, much smaller scale operation overall, and so the fact that we are seeing this pretty sizable increase over the years, again, kind of not quite exponential, more logarithmic, but definitely an upward sloping curve, absolutely, with the data there. Again, can be seen in the web story over with our news partners at KFOX 14. And it is, straining in its own way, but also the fact of the matter is that these are different kind of responses that they're having to deal with. They're often going on to other parts, other unimproved areas. They can get vehicles there, but we're dealing with a lot of then like blunt force falling kind of situations, or just other, all of the situations we've heard happening from people being essentially left at the border wall, not good ones.
Right. And they make a comment in there where they say that they're not going to stop providing this aid, this medical help if someone needs it, and if it's in the area where that corresponds to them.
Absolutely. So that's an important one. Again, see that full story over there. Also airing earlier this week with our news partners there at KFOX 14. One other one we wanted to mention in this circumstance here, a very interesting one of a cold case, 28-year-old cold case that now has a suspect that has been arrested. That is... I don't think I was paying attention to news when this crime originally occurred, basically, is where we're at.
Right. So El Paso police arrested a 69-year-old Arturo Ortega Garcia for the murder of three people, a 59-year-old man, a 28-year-old woman, and a 3-year-old boy. This was, almost 30 years ago. The victims were found in a home in the 1800 block of Garden Gate. This is in 1994, and this is near Montwood High School. And they really didn't have any leads up until 2015, and they were able to identify a suspect and put a warrant out for the suspect's arrest, but they weren't able to actually find him until 2020 when they found out that he had been arrested in Mexico City, and that's where he had been until he was extradited to the U.S. This week.
Yep, November 4th when that happened. So the fact that this was able to be moved on here is very interesting. There, 69-year-old Arturo Ortega Garcia, as you mentioned, they are now arrested for that murder. So it's not often that you hear about this kind of a cold case having, 3 decades, give or take here. The fact that this has happened and taken so long to look for, usually kind of don't expect anything to happen. So a notable case in that way. Though I'm sure a lot more prosecution and investigation will be happening from this point on.
Yes, this is something that, we had our reporters go out and talk to neighbors in the area. This is something that even though it happened so long ago, it still brings a sort of a sense of just security, knowing that finally there was a resolution to a case like this, especially a cold case like this one where it's involving 3 people. And the suspect was just at large, and having, them being able to identify him and then being able to arrest him, I think is something that a lot of neighbors had said just brought a little bit of peace, that knowing that, this happened in the area where they live, and they just feel a little more at ease.
Again, that right now is Estefania Seyffert, investigative reporter with our news partners there at KFOX 14. You want to see stories we've been talking about with her and some of her other reporting, kfoxtv.com, and click under the KFOX 14 Investigates tab. Got to take that next break right now. So coming out of this break, talking more with her about some of the other big stories going along and around the area, along with some of her other reporting. So stay tuned for more here on Talk El Paso on News Radio 690 KTSM. All right, and those of you sticking around for our Facebook audience are getting a little bit of the kind of behind the scenes here, I guess, as a little bit of added content for you as we are again out of the studio for today and through the rest of the week, but still bringing you some new things here. So, Estefania, I know that we say it a lot that you are able to, and you listen to the show and are able to get and some people have asked for you to show up in the comments, and I've gently reminded them that you also have a job to do and are often preparing to be on air more or less at the time that we are on air. So that's one of the reasons we pre-record these. But I mean, what kind of response have you really gotten from people when it comes to either you listening to the show and hearing them or them contacting you whenever we put out that information?
Well, I get a lot of really good story ideas, things that I wouldn't have thought of, because a lot of times it's issues that don't affect me personally, and that doesn't mean that it's not an issue at all. And so when there's something happening in a part of town where maybe I don't commute or I don't, live, it's great having people tell me, hey, in this part of town, there's this going on. That's extremely helpful because then I can look into that. Mm-hmm. I've had people reach out to me with issues because they haven't been able to get a hold of whether it's their, city rep, their county commissioner, their state rep.
Oh yeah.
So I can help with that, and that I can also reach out to their offices and try and get an answer for them if they're not able to. And so that's been the response I've gotten, is a lot of, story ideas, which has been very helpful because it's something that I can look into. Of course, it takes time. I know people always want to see it, the next day. And although we do have our reporters turning stories the day that they're happening, I get a little bit more time to work on my stories. And I think that helps me get a more well-rounded story. So I'm able to get a response from, that politician that you want to hear from, or just, that business, whatever it may be. I get a little more time to work on it and do a little bit more investigating, gives me a chance to provide more, data as far as numbers. Sometimes statistics aren't readily available. I have to request them. And that's just kind of the behind the scenes of how it works, because I know a lot of you have asked me, why they take so long or how exactly it works. And so that's just a little bit of how it works. Obviously, I get the story ideas from you all, start working on them, and then once I get all my elements, I'm able to air those stories.
Much like what we were just talking about with the labs, that CSI montages are not real, and often testing is really boring and involves waiting for a machine to finish its 12-hour cycle here. Same thing with reporting montages. As good as they show up in movies, TVs, whatever, showing, all this investigative work happening in the span of like 30 seconds, that's real time is a hell of a lot longer. So yeah, it takes time. It takes a lot of effort to put these together. So still keep them coming, but also patience, please.
Yes. And I do go back and look at the comments or listen to the segments. Like you mentioned, that's crunch time for me, or that's when we're on air, so I can't be in two places at once. But I do go back and I do look, and I do try and engage with you all as much as possible. A lot of you have just messaged me directly, which has been a lot easier. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Part of the reason that we mentioned that, and we will in this upcoming segment here. So this has been your a little bit of a sneak peek in between the segments here of kind of how it works here. So we're going to get into the recording for that next segment that will air as part of our broadcast as on Wednesday here. So getting into that segment, here we go. Welcome back here to Talk El Paso, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thank you for tuning in, however you may be doing so, be it on air, online, live streaming through the free and reliable iHeartRadio app, or kind of over on our social media here today. We have a segment that will be up there with Estefania Seyffert, with our investigative reporters there with our news partners at KFOX 14. But, of course, we are out of the studio for the remainder of this week, still bringing you some updates and things like that in our social posting, but we'll, of course, have some of the big interviews we've done, including with those candidates either moving on or into office, depending on if it's runoff or not here. So stay tuned for that for the rest of this week. But again, joining us here in studio for the second part of our interview here is Estefania Seyffert, investigative reporter with our news partners there at KFOX 14. Thanks for sticking around with us.
Yes, pleasure to be here.
Absolutely happy to have you on because there's a lot of big stories that we've been talking about, but there are, again, some more current, kind of those economic development or economic issues in general that we've been talking about going on in and around the region here. And one of the big ones that has come up kind of as an undercurrent for just about everything these days has been oil and gas and the supply, shortage, general costs, and those kind of things here. And there has been much time spent on exactly what's going on, who's to blame, those kind of things, even if we like to on this program focus more on the, okay, but what does it mean? What are the realities here? And the realities are that there have been a kind of a dearth of production and dearth of supply in a lot of ways, and some of the data coming out as of recent weeks is that these shortages, these supply impacts could be going on through possibly another couple of years.
Right, and so there are projections that for this winter, heating bills could jump 28% if you use natural gas, 27% if you use heating oil, 10% if you use electricity. And this is obviously tying into what people are already seeing with inflation. So they're already feeling, the hit of inflation. And now we're starting to see that because there are shortages in other areas, it's going to impact people's bills as well. So it's something that a lot of people are already bracing for, especially in the winter, because that's when we typically use a little bit, our utilities a little more. And that's something that a lot of people have their focus on right now is what they're calling this energy crisis.
So, of course, we have some slightly different situations here in El Paso. Among other things, we have some of those oil and gas production facilities here, though some of the major things, the point keeps coming up, that really affects the cost of other things, like added gas bills, or the going to paying at the pump does add on to your personal bill, but what then gets factored mostly into what you're buying off the shelves and the price changes you're seeing there, I think rightly pointed out as being primarily the diesel prices, which have been in their own flux and their own supply and those kind of issues here. So just as a point to be made there, yes, supply has been noted as low lately. Doesn't mean that we're necessarily out, because it's a kind of rolling production thing. We talk about that bathtub of essentially you got the faucet on, but the drain out at the end. And so that 20 days number that has been brought up previously is how much is currently in the tank, but also still more production, but also more going out. But again, these kind of situations likely to go on for another couple of years. 2024 was being mentioned there, so we'll keep our eye on the local situation. Of course, our news partners there at KFOX TV do have their own measures of it here. But one other thing I wanted to mention is not to make it a whole doom and gloom kind of thing, more of a kind of make sure you're informed with it, is also the fact that the city of El Paso, kind of related to some of the discussions we've been having with some of these city candidates that are up on the ballot, as we have been talking about, and may having some more to talk about with that. Get to that in a second. But more local development and, well, particularly for small businesses. I mean, there were a lot of impacts to be had for small businesses over the course of the pandemic, and I feel like the real impact of small businesses, and often like 1 or 2 person shops kind of thing, is underestimated in El Paso. The amount of cars I see going around that have, someone's side hustle on the side of it here, or their own shingle out there, is, I feel like, without looking at concrete numbers to be able to point at, to probably a majority of people in El Paso, even if it is their primary employment, it's still technically small business and them involved with it. So the fact that the city of El Paso, again with the Better Business Bureau, is looking at trying to help that out of it and deal with some of those issues is, well, encouraging in its own way, I suppose.
Right. So there's this new website that the city of El Paso, like you mentioned, along with the Better Business Bureau, have created. It's called Size Up El Paso. And it's to help level the playing field by providing smaller businesses with resources that are a little bit more specific to the industry that they're in, as well as information based on their location. And it's really meant to help these small businesses grow. We had talked about just how hard it's been for small businesses to hire people during the pandemic. It was a difficult time for small businesses to stay afloat. We're seeing this help that the city is providing, and there's a lot of different resources, if you will, that they're providing that have to do with like marketing, or just even comparing, helping them compare with like competitors in their industry or in their area, and so all of that information, and even the link to Size Up El Paso, is on this article on the KFOX TV website. And you can see more information because they're also having virtual workshops, which are free. And you can access when they'll be having those. I believe there's one this week. So that's just something important to have in case you're looking to start a new business or you already have a small business and would like to take advantage of these resources.
Again, guest right now is Estefania Seyffert, investigative reporter with our news partners there at KFOX 14. Find anything more about this story we're talking about, her investigative reporting, those kind of things throughout kfoxtv.com. And again, specifically for her reporting, KFOX 14 investigates. Click on that tab here. So we've been talking a bit about economic development and some of the trends in the area, which is, I mean, national ones are definitely one to be kept an eye on, but the local ones and how that interacts and the back and forth there is a little bit more interesting here. And of course, elections can have some impact on this, as this is policy based and something that the city of El Paso is doing. The new crop of city council members are definitely going to have an impact on this. And as we are recording ahead of election day, we don't have the full results to be talked about right here and how some of those policies may be going into it. But of course, that is something that you will be focusing on here for the reporting the evening that this is airing, right?
Right. So it's not just election day when we cover elections, it's the aftermath of it as well. Just based off of the results, there's a whole lot more stories to tell and a whole lot more to look into. And so that's what we're going to be diving into following elections. And the day of elections, obviously, it's all the races and the bonds and whatnot. But I mean, there's still so much to cover after the fact. So we'll, of course, keep you covered with all of that as well.
I mean, just a few of the things that will be delved further into will be, say, the results of the bond. Also, how the policies of the different candidates and what they were actually putting on their platforms as now are then either elected or potentially going to runoffs, how that will interact with it. So what kind of aspects do you anticipate being focusing on there?
Well, there's a lot of city races on the ballot, so that's something, and we've seen a lot of candidates. So like you mentioned, the potential of a runoff is there. Even if there's not, like you mentioned, going into what these candidates stand for and what they plan to, kind of get going once they take their positions. And so, really, there's a lot to cover. If there's anything that you all out there would like to specifically know about, or if you have any questions following, election day, please send those over because that's very welcome. That's something that we can look into and get you those answers, for sure.
Absolutely here. So if people want to get a hold of you, either for these purposes or for any of your other investigative reporting, those kind of things, what's the best way for them to do so?
So they can go through social media. A lot of you have. I guess that's easier, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. I can see those messages, or you can email me directly at eyseyffert@kfoxtv.com.
Absolutely. So, Estefania, thank you very much for coming by to check in with us as we do most Wednesdays, even if we are otherwise out of the studio this week, to keep us talking about what is going on, what is new, and what you will be doing in the upcoming reporting here today.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely happy to have you on. And with that, we will go ahead and take that next break now. And again, no calls coming out of this break, but stay tuned for more of our previous and ongoing and important things for those races that are still developing now. Interviews for more here on News Radio 690 KTSM. And for those of you all that are still on the social media, thank you for having joined us for this one segment we're going to be having on for you today. Again, not going to be in the studio the rest of this week, so the rest of this will be our previously recorded interviews and those, so we won't be putting those back up on social media. But don't worry, we'll be back in the studio next week, so thank you very much for joining us and some of these behind-the-scenes things, guys. Have a great one.